My father used to say the orchard didn't belong to us. We belonged to it. He'd say it every autumn, standing at the edge of the north row with dirt under his nails, watching the apple trees he'd planted as a young man finally heavy with fruit he'd never get tired of picking. I believed him, I still do in some strange way, even after everything that happened. My name is Harper, and for most of my adult life, that orchard sat quietly in the background of everything I did. I moved to the city after college. I built a career in logistics, the kind of job that eats your calendar and spits out a paycheck. My father passed 6 years ago, and when he did, the orchard passed to me and my Aunt Marcy jointly. She was the one who stayed. She was the one who knew the soil, the pruning schedules, the buyers who came every September for bushels of Honeycrisp and Gala. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She'd worked that land beside my father since before I was born. We had an arrangement that made sense on paper. Marcy ran the day-to-day operations. I handled the business side from a distance, taxes, insurance, the occasional wire transfer when equipment needed replacing. Twice a year I'd drive up for a weekend, walk the rows, sign whatever needed signing, and leave feeling like I'd done my part. The checks she sent me from the harvest profits were smaller each year, but she always had an explanation. A bad frost, rising costs of fertilizer, a slow market. I never questioned it too hard. Grief has a way of making you generous with your trust, especially toward the person who reminds you most of the parent you lost. It was in the spring of this year that something started to feel off, though I couldn't have named it at the time. Marcy called less. When she did call, the conversations were shorter, more clipped, like she was reading from a script and trying to get off the phone before I could ask a follow-up question. I told myself she was just tired. Running 60 acres alone isn't easy, and she wasn't young anymore. Then in June, I drove up for what was supposed to be a routine visit, and the first thing I noticed was the fence line. My father had strung that fence himself along the eastern boundary, marking where our land ended and the old Whitcomb property began. Except now, the fence looked different. Newer posts. A section that hadn't existed before, cutting the orchard shorter than I remembered. I asked Marcy about it over dinner that night, keeping my voice casual, the way you do when you're not ready to hear a bad answer. She said the county had come through and adjusted some boundary markers, nothing to worry about, just paperwork catching up with reality. I nodded and let it go because that's what I always did. But something in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes stayed with me the whole drive home. I didn't think about the fence again until August, when I got a call from someone I didn't recognize. A woman named Priya, introducing herself as a project coordinator for a solar development company. She was polite, professional, and completely unaware that her words were about to unravel 6 years of trust. She said she was calling to confirm a walkthrough date for the 12-acre parcel her company had purchased from our orchard 2 years earlier. I told her there had to be a mistake. We hadn't sold anything. She apologized, said perhaps she had the wrong contact, and read me a parcel number. I wrote it down with a shaking hand and told her I'd call her back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept turning the phone call over in my mind, looking for a version of it that made sense and not finding one. The next morning, I called the county assessor's office instead of Marcy. I told myself I was just being thorough, ruling out confusion before I raised it with her. The clerk who answered was helpful in the plain, unbothered way of someone reading numbers off a screen. She confirmed the parcel had indeed changed ownership 2 years ago. 12 acres, the eastern section, sold to a renewable energy company for a sum that made my stomach drop when I heard it. I asked whose signature was on the transfer. She said she couldn't read me the document over the phone, but I was welcome to request copies, since I was listed as a joint owner of the parent property. I drove up that weekend without calling ahead. When I arrived, Marcy was in the barn, going through invoices at the old desk that used to be my father's. She looked up at me and I watched her face do something complicated, surprise, then something closer to dread, quickly smoothed over into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I asked her directly whether we'd sold any land. She said no, absolutely not. Why would I even ask that? I told her about the phone call, about the parcel number, about the clerk at the assessor's office. For a moment, she just stood there, and in that silence, I understood with a sinking certainty that whatever she told me next was going to be a lie built on top of an older one. She said it must be some kind of clerical error, a mix-up with a neighboring property. She said she'd look into it. She said a lot of things that night, none of which sounded like the aunt I'd known my whole life, and all of which sounded like someone buying time. I went home that weekend with a folder of copied documents from the assessor's office. The signature on the transfer deed was supposed to be mine, since I was listed as a co-owner, and the sale required both signatures to be legally binding. I stared at that signature for a long time. It curved differently than mine. My real signature has a small loop on the H, this one didn't. It was close enough to pass a glance, but not close enough to be honest. I called a lawyer the following Monday, a woman named Odette Marsh who specialized in property disputes. She looked over the documents and told me plainly that if the signature wasn't mine, we were looking at forgery and possibly fraud, depending on how the sale proceeds had been used. She recommended I not confront Marcy again until we had more information, but grief and anger don't always listen to legal advice. I went back up to the orchard 2 weeks later, this time with the folder in hand. Marcy tried the same explanations, softer this time, edged with something like pleading. She said the orchard had been bleeding money for years, that the harvest income barely covered the property taxes anymore, that she'd been quietly drowning while trying to keep the business afloat so I wouldn't have to worry about it from the city. She said the solar company had approached her, offered more money than we'd see from apples in a decade, and she'd panicked and made a decision she thought she could explain to me later once she'd stabilized things. I asked why she never told me any of this, why she let me believe the orchard was simply having lean years instead of telling me the truth. She said she was ashamed. She said she didn't want to be the aunt who lost my father's land. Part of me wanted to believe that shame was the whole story, but I kept thinking about the fence posts, replaced months before I ever asked about them. I kept thinking about how carefully she'd worded her explanation on the phone that first night, like someone who'd rehearsed it. Shame doesn't usually come with a script. I told her I needed to see the full financial records, everything going back 3 years. She hesitated, then agreed, though it took her another week to actually hand them over. The records told a story that didn't match the one Marcy had given me. The solar company's payment for the 12 acres had come through, exactly as the assessor's office confirmed. But only a fraction of that money had ever touched the orchard's business account. The rest had moved through a personal account of Marcy's, in transfers that were labeled vaguely as consulting fees and equipment reimbursement, neither of which lined up with anything I could find in our actual equipment purchases. I sat at my father's old desk in the barn one evening, going through his handwritten ledgers from years before, the ones he'd kept out of habit even after we switched to digital bookkeeping. There was something grounding about his handwriting, blunt and practical, listing every expense down to the dollar. It made the discrepancies in Marcy's records look even starker by comparison. I found an old business card tucked into the back of one ledger, for a man named Roland Voss, a licensed land surveyor my father had apparently used years earlier to settle a dispute with the Whitcomb family over the very fence line I'd noticed in June. On a hunch, I called the number. It still worked. Roland remembered my father fondly, said he'd surveyed the eastern boundary for him almost 15 years ago and still had the original plot map on file. I asked if he'd be willing to come out and do a fresh survey to formally document exactly where our property lines stood now, compared to where they used to be. He agreed, and we scheduled it for the following weekend. I didn't tell Marcy he was coming. I told myself it was because I wanted an unbiased record, untouched by anything she might say or do to shape the outcome. But if I'm honest, some smaller part of me wanted to see her face when someone she couldn't argue with laid out the truth in front of both of us. Roland Voss showed up on a Saturday morning with a tripod, a set of surveying stakes, and the original plot map my father had commissioned all those years ago, yellowed at the edges but still legible. Marcy was in the barn when his truck pulled in, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to recognition to something close to panic in the span of a few seconds. He walked the property with careful, deliberate steps, comparing the old map to the current fence line, marking discrepancies with small orange flags. It took him most of the morning. When he finally spread both maps out on the tailgate of his truck, the difference was impossible to miss. 12 acres gone from the eastern boundary, exactly matching the parcel the solar company had purchased. And more than that, the fresh survey revealed that the new fence line had been drawn slightly beyond even the sold parcel, quietly absorbing another half-acre from the adjacent Whitcomb property in the process, likely to smooth out the boundary and avoid raising questions from either side. Roland pointed at the notary stamp on the transfer deed I'd brought with me, the one that was supposed to have authorized the sale. He said, almost offhandedly, that he recognized the notary's name, a man who'd retired from practice over a year before the date listed on our document. He said it the way someone mentions a minor technical detail, not realizing he'd just confirmed what Odette the lawyer and I had already begun to suspect. The notarization was fabricated. The whole transaction was built on paperwork that couldn't have existed the way it claimed to. Marcy didn't try to explain herself this time. She stood at the edge of the barn with her arms crossed, watching Roland fold up his maps, and for the first time since June, she looked less like someone caught in a lie and more like someone who'd simply run out of road. I asked her quietly in front of Roland whether there was anyone else involved, the solar company representative, maybe, someone who'd helped her push the paperwork through without either of us realizing how thin it really was. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was small in a way I'd never heard from her before. She said the company's land agent had known the notarization was irregular and had processed it anyway, eager to close the deal before a competing buyer came in with a higher offer for a different parcel nearby. Odette filed a formal fraud complaint within the week, both against the falsified notarization and against Marcy directly for forging my signature on the transfer. The solar company, once they realized the sale could unravel their claim to the land, moved quickly to settle rather than face a drawn-out legal battle. It wasn't the clean, dramatic justice you see in movies. It was slower than that, and quieter, mostly conducted through emails between lawyers and a mediation session in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee. In the end, the 12 acres came back to the estate, tied up temporarily in an agreement that required the company to either properly repurchase it through legitimate channels or return it outright. They chose to properly repurchase it, this time with my actual signature, at a price that finally reflected what the land was worth. Marcy avoided criminal charges by agreeing to repay what she'd taken and by signing over her half of ownership in the orchard to me alone. She moved out of the county by the end of that autumn. I still think about the version of her that used to walk me through the rows when I was a kid, naming every variety of apple like they were old friends. I don't know exactly when that woman started making the choices that led us here, or whether the debts she mentioned were even the real reason, or just the first excuse she reached for once she got caught. I've stopped trying to find a version of the story that makes her decisions feel forgivable. Some things don't need forgiving so much as they need understanding, and even that has its limits. The orchard is smaller now by 12.5 acres, but it's honestly mine, every line of it documented and clean. I hired a manager this spring, someone with no family ties to the land, someone whose only job is to run it well and tell me the truth when something's wrong. I still drive up twice a month instead of twice a year now. I walk the eastern fence line sometimes, the real one, the one Roland's map confirmed, and I think about my father telling me we belonged to this land, not the other way around. I think he'd be glad I finally believed him enough to go looking for the truth, even when it came from a stranger with a tripod, instead of the family member I trusted most.